Welcome back, inventory developers. Just take a look at how far we've come with our inventory system. But hold on to your swashbucklers. What if I told you our adventure is far from over? What if we could shatter the boundaries of our humble scene, embracing a world without limits? What if we could unleash a whole new realm of item types? What if we could hold stats on our items, and better yet, equip those items onto our character, allowing those stats to add up? So, without further ado, let's plunge headfirst into the depths of our inventory dreams and turn these fantasies into realities. Alright, to expand our scene, we need to talk about cameras. When we take a look at our scene, which I'm sure you can tell right now, mine looks a bit different than last time, because I lost my working copy from the first video, so I had to pull up my demo copy. And hopefully, everything is exactly the same. But, looking at our scene, we can see our scene area portrayed by that gray outline. And if nothing's changed with the camera, this is the area that will be focused. We can literally take our character and walk them straight off the edge, and everything's still going to work correctly. The user just won't be able to see what's happening. Now instead, if we wanted to focus on something like our player, which in our case we do, we will have to change it so our camera follows them instead. And thankfully Gdevelop has a built-in behavior called smooth camera behavior. And adding this is as simple as going to behaviors and hitting add. Now once we add the camera, we can see our character has the freedom to wander. But this has some effects on our earlier code in our inventory, mainly the visibility. This is because our inventory system used to just sit off screen and we would move it up a little bit when we were ready and then back down when we were done. Now that the camera moves, we don't really know where the inventory is. But the only reason that the camera is affecting our inventory is because it's on the same layer as our character, which has the camera on it. So if we simply create a new layer for our inventory to be on, that is above our previous layer to make sure it stays visible, this will fix our problems. And looking at the layers area, you can see I have created 2 new layers, and for now we'll be talking about the inventory layer. To create a new layer, just click on the Add a Layer button, name it as you see fit, then select an object or multiple objects on your scene, and simply change the layer in their properties to the correct layer you want. Additionally, for new items being added to the scene, you can control the default layer that will be selected by clicking on the small circle that's to the left of the layer. Once that's done, everything's starting to look like it's running well until we collect our first item. And it seems to disappear, and this is due to the fact that each subsequent layer has a higher visual order than the layer before it. And also our base layer is moving all the time, where our inventory layer is stationary. So to get our items to show again, we're going to need to change them to the new layer when we collect them. So in our event sheets, we're going to find our on collisions with both our items and stackable items. And inside our on collisions, we want to find the part of the code which is only when we find false inventory slot, because that's when we actually move the item into our inventory. And in those actions, we're going to add to change the item or item stackable to the new layer. And we'll also want to move them back down to their original layer if we are dropping items. Once they're done being in our inventory, we will move them back to the world layer. Now that our scene is expanded and our inventory is back in working order, we can work on our equip system. We are going to only focus on making these changes to items, ignoring our item stackables, though the concepts should be very similar. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you do run into issues on this, and depending on how difficult of a time you have, I might just go ahead and add a section into the next video on it. So to make our equip system work, we're going to need to add a few changes to our items. First, we'll be adding a new behavior, Draggable. This lets the user drag our items around. Since Gdevelop does not have a way to give behaviors to a group, we will have to go into each object individually in our items and add this behavior. Second, we're going to be adding several new variables. We already have collected to show if an item is in our inventory. And we'll want to do the same thing with a variable called equipped, and this will show if we're wearing that piece of gear. Also, we'll be adding 2 number variables, one for attack and one for health. And mine have some default values, but these will end up being overwritten in our event sheet when we randomize the stats. The last variable we need will be item type, which will be a string variable, and this will be used by our code to reject actions such as equipping a sword to a chest slot. Again, these changes will have to be made to each item, which is annoying. Quick tip, you can copy all of your new variables and paste them into each new item. But makes creating a new item a breeze, which we'll go ahead and do now. After changing our default layer back to our base layer, we can create a new object using built-in assets, just like we did in our first video, to add two new objects, a helmet and a chest piece. To make these work correctly, we'll have to add the behaviors, sticker and draggable, as well as the 5 variables, with item type for helmet set to helmet, and item type for chest set to chest. We'll also have to add both of these items to our items group. And now they're ready to go. Next, we need a new layer that will be for our equipment interface. On this new layer, we can add some form of background. Three different objects for slot weapon, slot chest, and slot helmet. And a text object. And we can go ahead and set the positions of these to where we want them to show up on our screen when we open our equipment menu. And keep in mind, if you've been following me exactly, we have been resizing our items and our inventory slots since the first episode, so we're going to need to do that again in this one. Now we will go ahead and add two new object groups, inventory holder, that will be used to check anything an item can go into. This will hold our 3 new equipment slots, as well as our original inv slot. And our next group will be equipment slot, and this will only hold our new slots that deal with equipped items.
And a little bit of scene cleanup. I want to make sure my equipment slots are all renamed. Also, later on in my code, I found it easier to maneuver the item's visibility with inventory being the highest layer. So let's drag and drop equipped below inside of our layers view. And we also need our equipment slots to have some of the variables our inv slots have. And even though we won't use all the variables right now, I will just copy and paste the whole lot over to each equipment slot, so we are ready for anything. I also added a small object to my inventory layer, as well as a text object, just to show the stats on all of our items. This was more for testing purposes, so I won't really be breaking it down in the tutorial.
And with that, we are ready to add some code to make this all work.
Alright, we're going to be taking our event sheet one group at a time, starting out with the testing group. The first 2 events track the Boolean variable full on our inventory holder group, which is of course all of our slot objects. And if full is equal to false, we'll set the opacity to roughly 60%. But when full is true, we'll bump the opacity up to 100%. And this allows us to easily see that our slots are correctly holding items. Also, I ended up really liking the look of it and decided to keep it in the code after testing. As for the other event, if we press our A key while our mouse is over any item, it will highlight any linked slots to a red shade. And we'll be using a lot of linking to track where items belong, and this is a helpful way to see if the wrong slot highlighted, meaning we lost track of our item and slot connection. This look was much less appealing, and it can be removed after we get the equipment system working correctly. In our second group, drag and drop, we'll have code to handle basic functions attached to dragging our items around. While we are dragging our item, our first condition is going to track if we are dragging our item and only trigger one time, which more specifically in this case means the first tick after starting to drag the item, because we want to track that starting item X and Y position for a spot to send our item back to if required. And we'll go ahead and store that position in a global variable called xPOSStart and yPOSStart, which we can create those variables now. Fun fact, if you were to put this in the code without creating the global variables, the engine would create the global variables for you during runtime, which means the code would still function perfectly. The only downside is that while you are making events, the engine does not know about the global variables if they were not already declared in the project settings global variables. So you'd have to fully type in the name and make sure you get it correct every time on your own. And the second part of the section is to put the item on the highest layer, so that it shows up no matter what objects you drag it over. Then when we drop the item later on, we'll deal with setting it back to the proper layer. Next, we take a look at all of our items and stackable items. If their boolean collected is set to true, then we can go ahead and activate Draggable. And if they're not collected, or it's set to false, then we'll turn it off, and this will allow you to only move items after you've looted them.
Alrighty, now it's time to give our items a reason to be equipped. That's stats. Generally, in-game, you would give your stats to items as they were created. But since ours are scattered across the ground, we can handle this with a simple at the beginning of the scene condition. First, since I want my stat check object to hang out with my inventory, I'll use the stick behavior and set our stat check to our inventory tiled sprite. Then, for each instance of items, we can go ahead and give a random amount of attack and HP. And the stat check system was created just to verify our items were holding the right values the whole time. So hopefully I'll be coming out with a much nicer version of this in the future. But in case you wanted this for now, here's how it works. Whenever we are not cursored over our stat check object, we will remove the two objects that will be added when we are cursored over. These will be the equip backgrounds, which are linked to the items. And this link is here because I reuse the same object, equip background, that is on our equipment layer, and we don't want to accidentally delete that one. Additionally, we'll want to delete our text object stats. And now whenever we are hovering over our stat check object, we will want to only one time, and also for every instance of items, go ahead and create that equip background object and stats text object. Then we can size and position them accordingly, and we'll also want to be wary of what layer we create these on, and we'll be using the inventory layer. We will also have to create that link between items and equip background, so that way it exists later when we go to delete it. And the way I work text here is it's always going to show up with stats, and then add the additional amount of attack and health to new lines, as long as those respective stats are not equal to 0. And there we go. Every one of our items that is collected will now show our stats whenever we cursor over stat check. Next up, we have our equipped code. First, we have what I call my lazy set stats design. And this is the lazy version since I call it every tick. This is a bit worse for performance, but nowhere near an amount that will be noticeable. And on the plus side, it ensures that we always have the most up-to-date stats showing. Since we don't have to call it whenever a value changes, such as when we're equipping or unequipping gear, the value is just always calculated. So every tick, the engine resets our values back to 0. Then, in a child node, it will recount those values, which those are stored in every item that is linked to an equipment slot. So as long as your equipped items are linked correctly, their value gets added to your total stats from equipped gear. And don't worry, the bulk of linked items will be covered in the next code portion, which comes from dragging and dropping our gear. Then, as you can notice, the values we're changing here, equip attack and equip health, are meant to hold our equipment total values, so that later on we can add those to our player stats when we're in combat. And now would be a great time to go ahead and add those globals. Next, we update the text of our text background object to display the total attack and total health. And the last bit of code for this section, we need a way to show and hide our equipped menu. Since equipped is its own layer, we can just go ahead and hide the entire layer and then show the entire layer. And this will all be based off of a global variable called equip GUI, which you can go ahead and create now. Then anytime E key is released, it will toggle between the true and false, showing and hiding the equipment layer.
Alright, let's talk about link. In simple terms, this ties two instances of objects to each other. To break it down further, we have objects, which are anything you see when you click the Add a New Object button. Objects are like a blank canvas, waiting for you to decide what they'll be. You can choose to make them a picture, like a sprite, some words, like text, or even something you can interact with, like a button. An instance is a single specific object. If we had a sprite object called sword, then I dragged 5 of them onto the scene, I would have 5 instances of the object sword. These instances need to follow the rules set by the object, so one of my swords can't be a text object, they all need to remain sprite objects. And they would also share behaviors and variables. But we are able to set these variables to be different from one another. And why does this matter for link?
Well, if at one point in our game we interact with a specific instance, later it becomes much harder to track what that instance was. With link, we simply link together during our first interaction, then later on, we just check to see if link exists before deciding what we want to do next. For this project, we will be linking items to inventory slots. So our first step will be to go back to our episode 1 code and add a link between our items in our inventory slot when we first collect our items. And with this single line of code, we now link every item when we first place them in our inventory, and we will continue to build on this throughout our item movement code. Also, using the code we added earlier from testing, we can go ahead and drop an item from our inventory and press A on it, and we can see we are still linked. So we need to also go into our code from episode 1 and unlink items when they are dropped. And that should cover everything from episode 1. Great, now that we understand link, we are ready to allow our players to rearrange our inventories. Our draggable system is set up, but the way it works out of the box is not how we want it to work in an inventory system. There are a few overlying rules that we want to make sure happen every time an item is moved. First, every time an item is moved, it should end up neatly inside one of our inventory slots. Dragging an item to the edge of an inventory slot and letting go should not move our item so it's no longer centered. And this will be the same for hitting a different slot, whether it be the inventory or the equipment. If we hit a new slot and we end up triggering the item to move, the item should end up centered in the new slot. Second, for every item we move, we need to unlink and relink that item so that we can always track where our item belongs. We will want to unlink the item only after we are sure they are moving to a new slot, where we will then relink them. Another rule had to be made for dropping an item outside of all inventory holders. I was debating on dragging and dropping the item outside to trigger a drop item event, but we already have a built-in drop item event from episode 1, so instead I'm just going to snap the item back to where it started. The last few rules also ended up being dependent on where we dropped our item. If we hit another inventory slot, we will be moving our item 100% of the time. But if that slot already has an item in it, we will need to send our other item back to our starting point. Then if we hit an equipment slot when moving an item, we first need to verify the item type before we decide if we need to move our item. Then additionally, we'll still have to check for if that equipment slot already has an item and swap that one back. So with all these in mind, let's jump into the code. Here it is, and it's a beast. But as we have been discussing for the last few minutes, this is a lot of code to handle. And all this upcoming code is conditioned on if an item is dropped, and anytime one is dropped, we'll go ahead and check to see what should happen. Along with that, we'll be creating a new global variable, feel free to create it now, called previous condition with a default of false. This boolean is reset to false every time we start this condition and is responsible for skipping later events. And we'll go ahead and set this to true right away if we hit our first condition. After that, we'll be sending our items, yes plural, every item, back to its link slot. And this little bit of code here we end up using multiple times, and it's going to be our go-to condition for resetting all of our items. Let's take a deeper dive into what this does. First, pick all. We want to make sure that our system is looking at all the items, and since we have an above condition, narrowing down the items we're currently looking at, to the item that we just dropped, we will have to set pick all so our items can be reset. And we'll also do the same for inventory holder objects, just to be sure. Once we have all these objects reset, we'll go through each inventory holder spot and find any linked items and set that position to the inventory holders X and Y. Next up is our code for if our drop hits an inventory slot. So we will check if the collision is with an inv slot, and furthermore, we will pick the nearest one to our item just in case our item is dropped where it is touching two different slots. And in here we will also be skipping previous condition equals false. Since we know if we touch an inventory slot, we are moving our item either way, we can go ahead and mark the starting inv slot boolean false, so it's ready to be used again. And to grab the correct inv slot, we will use the pick all inv slots and pick the one closest to our global boolean x POS start and y POS start. Since remember, we grab these x and y coordinates as soon as we scoop up an item to remember where we started from. Next, we take into account if the new inv slot was already full before we dropped it, simply by checking the full boolean. Since this is a child node of the items is in collision with inv slot, the engine is already looking at our one specific inv slot where we dropped our item. We will go ahead and set this inv slot to false, which now makes both our starting and ending im slots empty. We will then set the position of our new item so it is centered inside the slot. We will then pick all the im slots so we can find the one closest to our item X and Y position and link them to the closest item. Now our sendback item is in the correct spot and also linked to the im slot closest to it. And our newly dropped item is in the correct spot but still needs to be linked. So we will use the conditions to narrow down the correct im slot and link that item. And just to verify all items are in their link slots, we will reuse the code we already used above and send all items back to their correct slots. Next up, we want to tackle if our drop hits the equipment slot. First, we will check if the type matches. So, we have a large OR condition that holds 3 AND conditions inside. This would read something along the lines of, if our item's variable item type is called weapons, and the collision is with slot weapon, or if the item's variable item type is called helmet, and the collision is with slot helmet, or, and the same for slot chest. At this point, we will set our previous condition to true, so we can block later code from happening. And from here on out, the code is almost exactly the same. The only difference is we have to switch the item's layers to the correct layer of interaction. So if we end up dropping into an inventory, we need to switch to inventory, and dropping on equipment, we'll need to switch to equipped. And the last bit of code here relies on the condition previous condition is false. And since we set the condition to true, if the item type was a match, if it's false, we are left with a mismatch. And we will treat this just like dropping an item onto nothing, and we'll end up just sending it back, which can be done by resetting our pick all for items and inventory holders, then just setting every item to their linked inventory positions, like we did above multiple times. Thanks for checking out my video. If you bump into any questions, feel free to leave them down below. Also, if you feel like supporting me, please check out my YouTube membership page, which there'll be a link for in the description. Once again, I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to each and every one of my dedicated followers who have taken the extra step to join my YouTube members page. Your support means the world to me, and I'm truly grateful for each and every one of you. Thank you.